time when the Joker was this silly, almost queer-coded agent of chaos that was a popular villain, but not this icon for disaffected, predominantly white men. When I was a kid, I saw Jack Nicholson as the Joker in the first Batman movie, and I thought, yeah, that's cool. But nobody wanted to be him. Same thing for the Joker in the reruns of the 1960s and the classic cartoon series in the 90s. But then in 2008, with The Dark Knight Returns, the gritty revamp of the Batman films, we got a new reimagining of the Joker as representing the aforementioned disaffected group of angry, predominantly white men. And I've talked in multiple videos now on how that image of the Joker is so iconic to these men and boys because it embodies a fantastical, ultra-violent response to an indifferent and cruel society that both causes their dysfunction and rejects them forward. And because of this, they lash out. And while the Joker's popularity has waned as the years have gone on, the sentiment behind his popularity has gone nowhere. The chaotic, evil desire to have revenge on society is just as salient in a lot of young, predominantly white men, Dax notwithstanding. The last Batman movie just took the same character motivation and put it on the Riddler at this time instead of the Joker, just because it still is just as salient now as it has been probably for several generations. This nation is full of angry, nihilistic, and potentially violent young men trying to get anyone to pay attention. And I don't think people realize how integral that sentiment is to movements like the American Nazis or Turning Point USA. These photos that we see of these young men back years ago in Virginia, these are not white men who are well on track in life, who are finding their way easily through this world. No, these are rejects. We're seeing the type of men that if the Joker was real, they probably would have been some of his goons, or as Rockwell duly named, stormtroopers. Stormtrooper might sound like Tyler Robinson. The limited info on Robinson indicates that he was actually a young man of significant intelligence, having a 4.0 GPA, scoring 34 out of 36 in his college entrance exams, ranking him in the top 10% of testers. Yet he went to an unremarkable state school and dropped out after one semester to enter trade school. He was described as shy and quiet by many and was clearly deep into internet culture if the memes he put on the bullet casings and his choice of Halloween costumes are of any indication. And that's all we know, really. Over a month after this huge story, it's been radio silent on any new information and why he did this. Conservatives like to say the memes on his bullet cases indicate a left-wing political standing. However, the memes are also well-known memes in right-wing spaces meant to mock the left. The only other ostensibly left-leaning aspect of Robinson's life is the revelation that he was allegedly in a queer relationship with his roommate who was said to be trans, though there's minimal evidence of that as well. Mind you, Tyler Robinson being bisexual or pansexual or whatever wouldn't make him any less right-wing. Right-wing men are very much fans of queer sex and trans women. The log-cabin Republicans are a thing. Gay Nazis were a thing, even amongst Rockwell's group. If you talk to trans women, they will tell you some of their biggest fans tend to be Republican men. There's also been some effort by those on the left to say that Robinson was actually far-right and killed Kirk because he wasn't right-leaning enough. Many connect the memes to other far-right groups, specifically those led by Nick Fuentes, who is a constant and persistent critic of Charlie Kirk publicly. There's a lot of internet lore there that sounds plausible from a biased position, but there's little validity to support this assertion as well. Then, of course, we have the conspiracy theories that it was about the Epstein files or the Israel lobby, body doubles, and all kinds of stuff that comes from these moments. But at the end of the day, until we hear from Tyler directly, we don't have a strong understanding of why he allegedly did this. All that said, I have what I think is a compelling explanation, which is that Tyler Robinson was like a lot of young white men, except he's evolved somewhat. Tyler didn't technically commit an act of mass violence. Instead, he made a mass spectacle of violence. We'll explain this a bit by talking about spree shooters. There's been a lot of effort as of late by the state, law enforcement, and of course people like Charlie Kirk to reframe spree shootings and mass killings in ways that fail to isolate the disproportionately white male and right-wing nature of these mass violence incidents. All domestic terror acts of mass violence and spree shootings are disproportionately done by right-leaning straight white males. Kirk's incredibly ironic last words were him responding, counting or not counting gang violence, to a question about spree shootings. He was trying to insert a racist dog whistle to deflect from the point of the question, and he did this because engaging with the reality of what spree shootings are in America will require us to critically look at white people, white men specifically. The right has put a lot of effort in making street shootings an issue of trans people somehow, even though most research indicates that trans people make up less than 1% of all street shootings. And bringing up mass shootings in the context of street violence as if it's a black inner city gang thing hides the white male right-wing nature of the phenomenon even more. Gang violence and street shootings have completely different circumstances and motivations and thus responses. But conflating those two is the point for men like Kirk. Again, the goal isn't the greater truth or understanding, it's breaking containment. This is not to say that all street shootings that aren't a part of street violence are done by only white men. There's figures like Brian Nichols or Christopher Dorner as examples of black street shooters, but aside from being relatively rare, it's also not hard to recognize the difference between someone like Christopher Dorner, who went on a killing spree over being fired from his job as a police officer, versus Scott Paul Bierle, who killed 6 women at a yoga studio because he was depressed and couldn't get a date. And again, there are some black street shooters with similar motifs, but they pale in comparison to the amount of white ones. While both events are abhorrent, only one reminds me of the popularity of the Joker. Only one involves this vague desire for retribution on society, which tends to be the unique motivation for mostly right shooters and almost no one else. In the aftermath of Kirk's murder, the term nihilistic terrorism or nihilistic violent extremists popped up on people's radar.
Talk about nihilistic violent extremism, but haven't really set out to define what it is, and a lot of people don't know what it is. So what is it?
At its simplest terms, nihilistic violent extremism is a practical definition that allows authorities, specifically law enforcement and the FBI, to attribute acts of violence that are terroristic in nature but lack a singular ideological focus. It's individuals who are mobilized by maybe 3 or 4 ideologies, but none of them hold a primacy over that person's beliefs or why they took the violent actions they did. But nonetheless, they're seeking to exploit the weaknesses in society through violent means and hoping to see it collapse or at least degrade a little further.
Essentially saying, we don't really understand why he did this. But I think that's a lie. This ignores a very obvious factor in many of these events, the desire for attention.
So you think Batman's made Gotham a better place? Look at me.
Going all the way back to the Columbine killers. When you read their writings and the writings of other spree shooters, you see a ton of patterns, and one of them is the desire for people to see what they're going to do, to witness them. Many leave behind manifestos. They send press kits to the media. They document their preparation, release videos of themselves. Some even live stream themselves in the midst of the act. They stylize themselves in ways to build an aesthetic, often paying tribute to other shooters or images of white spectacle violence. The Columbine shooters, for example, often got accused of being fans of The Matrix or that there was a connection there, but actually they were clearly referencing this scene from 1995's Basketball Diaries. These acts are intended to give them meaning in a world where they feel meaningless. And I would argue that even the killers who do seem more politically or specifically motivated still desire some sense of notoriety and attention. Dylan Roof was an overt white supremacist, and his killing, like many right-wing terrorists, was explicitly for the goal of starting a race war through which so many people, black and white, would have died, again inspired by the Turner Diaries, another part of Rockwell's legacy. Roof aggrandized himself as the only person resolute enough to do what had to be done for white people, and wrote in his diary in jail how he hated that people had the nerve to question exactly why he was doing what he was doing, to question his mental wellness or say he had a drug problem. He didn't want any of those normal excuses y'all be giving to these white boys. He was adamant, and he's been very clear since then, that he has no sorrow for the lives that he took. You don't do this much because you're indifferent to being known and understood. No. You want to be known and understood. You want your words and actions to be influential and mean something. And I know this because law enforcement knows this. Since probably the mid-2010s, when it became clear that mass shootings were just going to be a thing we had to deal with here in America, the media and authorities began to give less attention and energy to spreading the names and faces of the perpetrators of these crimes.